Hello and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below if you'd like to hear more bedtime stories filled with mystery and quiet wonder. Now, settle in, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away by the story. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in October 2019 when Jonathan Clark, a retired English teacher from London, found himself wandering through a narrow cobblestone street in Boston. The city was alive with the faint hum of tourists and the occasional clang of a trolley bell. Yet Jonathan sought the quieter corners where history seemed to breathe through the brick walls. On the corner of Charles Street, tucked between a cafe with fogged-up windows and an antique map shop, he discovered a bookstore. Its wooden sign creaked softly above the door, reading Whitmore's Rare and Used Books. The glass on the front window was slightly smudged, and inside, shelves leaned gently under the weight of forgotten stories. The scent of aged paper hung in the air, mixed with a faint aroma of roasted coffee drifting in from the cafe next door. Jonathan entered slowly, running his hand along the spines of books that whispered of centuries gone by. The place was nearly empty, save for an elderly man behind the counter, Mr. Whitmore himself, perhaps, who greeted him with a nod and then returned to scribbling in a large leather-bound ledger. As Jonathan drifted deeper into the maze of shelves, his eyes fell upon a thin, leather-backed volume of poetry. Its cover faded to a dull brown. When he opened it, a fragile sheet slipped out and fluttered the floor. Stooping to pick it up, he realized it wasn't just a scrap of paper. It was a letter, yellow with age, its edges brittle, its ink still legible though faded into a soft sepia tone. The letter was dated May 14th, 1923. At the top, in neat cursive handwriting, it began, "My dearest Eleanor." Jonathan paused, the words tugging at him with an intimacy he could almost feel. He glanced around, as though worried he might be intruding on a secret he had no right to read. Yet curiosity, gentle but insistent, pushed him further. He carefully unfolded the letter and began to trace the lines with his eyes. The writer, a man named Henry Whitfield, had been an Englishman living in Boston nearly a century before. His words carried a tone of longing, describing his walks along the Charles River, his work in a shipping office near the harbor, and most of all, his loneliness. It seemed Henry had left England behind, but his heart had remained across the sea with Eleanor, whom he addressed with tenderness in every sentence. Jonathan felt the air shift around him, the muffled creak of the bookstore floorboards, the rustling of pages in distant corners, all faded into silence. He could almost imagine Henry sitting by candlelight, pen in hand, pouring his heart into the fragile paper that now lay in Jonathan's own hands. Outside, the light through the window dimmed as clouds gathered, and the bookstore grew slightly darker. Jonathan realized he was holding a fragment of a life, a window into a story that had perhaps never been told aloud. He wondered, had Eleanor ever received this letter, or had it remained hidden all these years, pressed between forgotten pages, until fate placed it into his grasp on this quiet Boston afternoon? Jonathan folded the letter carefully and placed it back between the pages of the poetry book. But the words lingered in his mind, as though urging him to seek out the truth. Who was Henry Whitfield? Who was Eleanor? And how had their story become stranded in this bookstore? Waiting nearly 100 years for someone to stumble upon it. With a quiet breath, Jonathan knew his afternoon had shifted. He was no longer just a visitor in Boston. He had become a custodian of a mystery that begged to be uncovered. Jonathan stood for a long moment with the book still in his hand, his thumb resting gently against the fragile pages that sheltered the letter for almost a century. The air in the bookstore seemed thicker now, as though time itself had drawn closer to listen. He closed the poetry volume, his mind racing with questions, then carried it carefully to the counter where the old bookseller sat. The man looked up, his spectacles sliding slightly down the bridge of his nose. His hair, wispy and white, caught the dim afternoon light that seeped through the tall windows. "Find something interesting, sir?" the bookseller asked, his voice low but steady, the kind of voice that belonged to a room filled with dust and silence. Jonathan hesitated, then laid the book on the counter and opened it just enough to reveal the letter inside. "This slipped out," he said quietly. "It looks rather old." Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted his glasses. He lifted the letter with surprising care, as though it were a relic. For a few moments he said nothing, only tracing the faded ink with his gaze. Then he exhaled slowly. "I've owned this shop for nearly 40 years, he said. "And even before me, my father ran it. I've seen plenty of odd things tucked between pages. Train tickets, photographs, grocery lists. But I can't say I've ever seen a letter quite like this. Do you know anything about the name?" Jonathan asked, his voice cautious, though his heart pressed full with urgency. "Henry Whitfield. Does it ring a bell?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Boston has had its share of Englishmen passing through. Merchants, scholars, men seeking a new beginning. But no, the name doesn't mean anything to me." Jonathan nodded, though disappointment flickered briefly across his face. He bought the book without hesitation, insisting on keeping the letter with it. Mr. Whitmore only smiled faintly, perhaps sensing that the discovery had already bound itself to Jonathan's journey in ways neither of them could explain. When Jonathan stepped back onto Charles Street, the late afternoon sky was heavy with clouds, casting the city in muted grays. The wind carried a chill that smelled faintly of the harbor. He pulled his coat tighter, clutching the book under his arm as though protecting a secret. That evening, back in his small rented room in Beacon Hill, he sat at the wooden desk by the window. The room overlooked a narrow lane where gas lamps flickered against red brick buildings. Jonathan lit a small lamp, set the letter gently on the desk, and read it again, slower this time, as though Henry's voice might rise from the paper if only he lingered over the words long enough. The letter spoke of longing, but also of uncertainty. Henry wrote of ships coming and going, of nights when the city's noises reminded him of home, and of his determination to build something in this new land. Yet beneath the practical words lay a tenderness that belonged only to Eleanor. He promised her that once he had saved enough, once his work was secure, he would send for her. He spoke of the Charles River, describing how he walked its banks, imagining her at his side, hearing her laughter in the wind. Jonathan closed his eyes. The intimacy of the words stirred something in him, a reminder of his own late wife, Margaret, whose absence still pressed heavily on his heart even after 5 years. Perhaps that was why this letter struck him so deeply, because it carried the echo of a love that might have endured separation, oceans, and time itself. The next morning, Jonathan's curiosity hardened into resolve. He made his way to the Boston Public Library, that grand building of stone and marble that stood like a cathedral of memory. Inside, the scent of old paper mingled with the faint hum of visitors. He approached the reference desk and explained what he had found. The young librarian, intrigued, guided him toward the archives and genealogical records. Hours slipped by as Jonathan combed through census lists, ship manifests, and city directories from the 1920s. His finger traced names on brittle pages, his eyes weary yet determined. At last he found it. Henry Whitfield. Occupation: clerk at Harrington Shipping Company. Residence: a boarding house on Tremont Street. Age 32. Place of birth: Brighton, England. Jonathan copied the details into his notebook, his pulse quickening. Here was proof that Henry had been real, that his voice on the page belonged to a man who had walked the same streets nearly a century before. But of Eleanor there was no trace, not in Boston, at least. Perhaps she remained in England, waiting, as the letter suggested. As evening approached, Jonathan left the library and wandered down Tremont Street. Modern traffic surged past, neon lights flickered, and the hum of the city felt far removed from the 1920s. He tried to imagine the boarding houses that once lined the street, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the sound of boots on cobblestones. Somewhere in these shadows, Henry had lived, written letters by lamplight, and dreamed of Eleanor. Jonathan felt a strange kinship with him, as though the years between them had collapsed. He whispered the name under his breath, Henry Whitfield, letting it linger in the evening air. That night, unable to sleep, Jonathan opened his laptop and searched passenger lists for ships traveling between England and Boston during the 1920s. His eyes burned as he scanned through names. Eleanor did not appear. No record suggested she had ever crossed the ocean. A thought struck him. Perhaps the letter had never been sent. Perhaps Henry had written it, tucked it away in his book of poetry, and for reasons unknown, it had remained hidden there when he moved on, or when life denied him the chance to send for her. The possibility haunted Jonathan. A love unfulfilled, a promise left suspended in time. Days turned into a week as Jonathan dug deeper. He visited the Massachusetts Historical Society, pored over shipping company records, and traced fragments of Henry's life. He discovered that Harrington Shipping had closed in the 1930s, its ledger scattered across various archives. He found mention of a Henry Whitfield who had fallen ill in 1926, his name listed in a hospital registry. Beyond that, the trail grew faint. But one evening, as he sat with a cup of tea in a quiet cafe on Newbury Street, Jonathan overheard two graduate students discussing a digital archive of letters recently scanned from families in England and America. His heart leapt. He introduced himself, explained his search, and they directed him to the collection online. Later that night, back in his room, Jonathan scrolled through the archive. His hands trembled slightly as he searched for Whitfield. Then, at last, another letter appeared. This one dated August 1924. It was from Eleanor, addressed not to Henry, but to his boarding house in Boston. She had written of her longing, her hope that he would return, her worry that his silence meant he had forgotten her. She spoke of Brighton's shore, of the sound of gulls in the morning, and of the ache of waiting. The letter ended with a line that caught Jonathan's breath. If you cannot come back to me, Henry, then please know that I have loved you, across every tide and every season, and I will love you still when the waves have long washed away our names. Jonathan leaned back, his chest tight, his eyes moist. Here, at last, was Eleanor's voice reaching across the years. Yet the mystery deepened. Why had Henry's letter never reached her? Why had hers not reached him? Were they lost in the chaos of mail, or had fate intervened more cruelly? Jonathan knew then that he could not stop. He had to follow this thread back to England, to Brighton, to see if Eleanor's story had left any trace upon the shore she described. He folded the letters back into his notebook and gazed out at the night sky above Boston. The city lights flickered like scattered stars. Somewhere in the silence, he felt Henry and Eleanor waiting. Two voices separated by oceans and time, now calling to him to uncover what had become of their love. And so, with a quiet resolve, Jonathan began to plan the next step of his journey. The ticket lay in Jonathan's hand like a promise. He had booked a flight from Boston Logan to London Heathrow, and from there he would take the train south to Brighton, the place Eleanor had once written about so tenderly. As the day of departure approached, Jonathan felt a strange mixture of excitement and solemnity. This was no ordinary trip. It felt as though he were answering a call across time, carrying the weight of two voices that had never been able to meet again. On the morning of his flight, Boston was gray with rain. The windows of the taxi blurred with droplets as he rode toward the airport, the city receding behind him. He pressed his hand against the small satchel on his lap, where he had carefully placed a letter from Henry, along with a printed copy of Eleanor's reply he had found in the archive. They were like compass needles guiding him. The flight was long, a stretch of hours in which Jonathan sat with his thoughts. He watched the Atlantic below, the endless expanse of water that had once separated Henry and Eleanor. He imagined the ships of the 1920s crossing this very path, carrying letters, hopes, and promises that sometimes never arrived. As the plane descended toward London, dawn broke, painting the horizon with muted shades of gold and rose. From London, Jonathan took the train to Brighton. The countryside rolled past a window, fields and hedgerows blurred by the speed of the carriage. When at last the train pulled into Brighton station, he stepped onto the platform with a quiet breath. The air smelled faintly of salt. Beyond the rooftops, he could sense the presence of sea. Brighton was alive with color and movement. The pier stretched out into the waves, its iron bones glinting in the sunlight. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the roar of the water. Jonathan stood for a moment, letting the wind wash over him. Try to imagine Eleanor walking here nearly a century ago. He began his search at the Brighton History Center, housed in a building near the Royal Pavilion. Inside, the smell of dust and aged paper reminded him of Boston's archives. A kind librarian named Mrs. Havers listened patiently as Jonathan explained what he was seeking. She tilted her head, eyes soft with curiosity, and then guided him toward parish records, electoral rolls, and local newspapers from the 1920s. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the scratching of Jonathan's pen across his notebook. Then, in a parish registry dated 1927, he found it. Eleanor Whitfield. Address, Marine Parade. Occupation, governess. Status, unmarried. Jonathan's pulse quickened. Here she was, living on the edge of the sea, not far from the pier he had just walked past. He copied down the details, then leaned back, his breath uneven. The record gave no more than her address and her occupation, but was enough to confirm she had remained in Brighton, waiting, perhaps, for Henry's return. That evening, Jonathan walked along Marine Parade. The houses stood tall and elegant, white facades facing the restless waves. Some had been converted into hotels, others into flats, but their bones were old enough to have stood in Eleanor's time. He stopped outside one, number 36, its windows glowing softly in the twilight. He wondered if she had once stood at that very window, staring out the horizon, waiting for a letter that never came. The following days drew him deeper into the search. At the archives of the Argus, Brighton's local newspaper, Jonathan discovered small notices from the 1920s. Among them, in September 1926, a brief line caught his eye. Death notice. Henry Whitfield, clerk, formerly of Brighton, passed away in Boston, Massachusetts. Jonathan froze, the paper trembling in his hands. So this was it. Henry had died in America. His life cut short before he could return, before he could bring Eleanor across the sea. The letter he had written, the one Jonathan had found, had remained unsent because death had silenced him. Jonathan sat back heavily, his chest aching. He imagined Eleanor receiving no news, only silence stretching across the months, her letters unanswered. Perhaps she read the notice in this very newspaper, her heart breaking as she realized she would never see him again. The next day, Jonathan returned to Marine Parade and stood again outside number 36. He closed his eyes, listening to the crash of waves against the shore. He could almost hear Eleanor's footsteps on the pavement, the rustle of her skirts, the faint murmur of her voice carried by the wind. Driven by a need to know more, Jonathan searched parish death records and found that Eleanor had lived on Marine Parade until 1954. She had never married. The final entry listed her burial at a small cemetery near the outskirts of Brighton. On a quiet morning, Jonathan made his way there. The cemetery was old, the stones weathered, moss creeping along their edges. He walked slowly among the graves until he found it. a modest headstone, its inscription worn but legible. Eleanor Whitfield, 1894 to 1954. Beloved daughter, faithful friend. There was no mention of Henry, no hint of the love she had carried. Yet Jonathan felt it nonetheless, like an invisible thread stretched across time. He knelt before the grave, placing his hand gently against the cool stone. "I found your letter," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I found his too. He loved you, Eleanor. He truly did. He never forgot you." For a long time he remained there, the wind stirring the leaves overhead. He thought of Margaret, his own late wife, and how love, once etched into his soul, never truly faded. He realized then that perhaps this journey had been as much for himself as it was for Henry and Eleanor. To be reminded that love leaves traces, even when time and circumstance conspire against it. Jonathan stayed in Brighton for another week, visiting the pier, walking along the beach at dusk, tracing the footsteps Eleanor might once have taken. He carried the letters with him everywhere, as though they were fragile lanterns lighting his path. One evening, sitting on a bench overlooking the sea, he opened Henry's letter once more. The ink had faded, the words worn, yet their tenderness still shone through. Jonathan read them aloud softly, letting the wind carry them out over the waves. For the first time in nearly a century, Henry's words reached the shore where Eleanor had once waited. He did not know if she could hear them now, but the act itself felt sacred, a mending of something that had long been left broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sea in shades of crimson and gold, Jonathan felt a quiet peace settle over him. The story of Henry and Eleanor might have ended in sorrow, but their love, carried through fragile letters and now through his own discovery, had found its voice once again. And yet, deep within him, Jonathan knew the journey was not over. He had uncovered their past, but something urged him further. Perhaps to trace Eleanor's surviving family, if any remained, or to uncover more of Henry's life in Boston before his untimely death. The story had not yet finished weaving its threads through his own. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back in his satchel, and rose from the bench. The waves crashed steadily against the shore, timeless and unyielding, as though reminding him that stories, like tides, always return, carrying with them fragments of what has been lost. And so Jonathan walked back toward the town, the night gathering around him, carrying in his heart both the weight of the past and the quiet anticipation of what he might yet discover. Jonathan Kembali Kupinjinapan Kasilnya D. Brighton Malum ITU Dengen Lankapellan D. Lure Yidara Lot Masi Teresa Dinjin Dan Aroma Asin Masi Melikat Deepakayanya Lampa Jolan Cunning Pukit Berteret Sapanjay Marine Parade Cementera Swar de Bur Ombak Menyurtai Sidiap Lankanya Sesampanya D. Kamar I Menulakan Lampa Medja Mimbuka Katatanya Lao Menuliskan Kalamat Sinkat Yang Munkle Bejida Sajadi Benaknya. Love endures, even when history forgets. Naaman, I Tahu Penkarianya Tidak Bereni Disana. I Suda Menemukan Makam Eleanor, Membeka Katadin Sinkat, Tentang Henry. Dan Menyadari Bagamana Nazib Kedawanya to Pizza Ola Jarek Dan Waktu. Tetapi Masi Ada Pertanian Yang Tak Turjawab. Apaka Kedawanya Menin Galkan Jajak Keluarga. Apaka Ada Orangyon Masi Hitup. Yang Munkin Menian Peningadan Samar Tente Marika. Page I Barakutnya. Jonathan Memituskan Untuck Mengan Junji Canner Katadin Sippledy Brighton Untuck Menkari Kamunkanan Karabat Eleanor. Patugas Arsip. Sirang Juanita Para Baya Bernama Clara. Membentunya Menalujri Katadin Kelahiran Dan Keluarga. Dari Sana. Jonathan Menemukan Bawa Eleanor Memaliki Sirang Kakak Laka Laki Bernama Thomas Whitfield. Yang Menikadan Memaliki Dua Anik. Dari Garris Inlaka Munkanen Ketarunan Masieda. Clara. Yang Tampak Turdrak Ola Ketakunan Jonathan. Menurank and Agar I Menalujri Dapta Pemalai Turbru Untuck Menemukan Keluarga Whitfield Yong Munkin Masi Tingal, di Sekitar Sussex. Aye Bakum and Barrack and Nama Yong Munkin Relevin. George Whitfield, Chuchu Dari Thomas. Nama itu Cedra Dikatat Jonathan D. Buku Kasilnya. Hari itu Langat Brighton Tampak Sira. Kahaya Matahari Berkalo D. Permukin Lot. Jonathan Burgela Melawati Gang Sempit. Cave Kessel. Dan Toko Antic. Sebla McKernia Sampai D. Sabua Ruma Seder Hannah. Deep in Jiren Koda. Alamat Yondai Barrack and Clara. Ruma itu Berwarna Puti Dengen Taman Kessel D. Depanya. Penabunga Lavender Yong Bergerac Lembet Turdiup Angin. Aye Menstuk Pinta Dengen Hattie. Siorang Priya Baruja Sekatar Nam Pulahan. Rambutni Mamuti di Palipis. Membuka Pintu. Yeah. Tanyanya Dengen Swarbarat. Naaman Tidak Azar. Jonathan Mebakanalkin Deary. Menjalaskan Asayu Salnya. Dan Menyabut Nama Eleanor. Priya itu Tampak Turkjut. Alisnya Tarankat. Sebel McKernia Tersenium Samar. Eleanor Whitfield Jeb Bibi Bayat Saya. Ujarnya Pelin. Kami Hanya Tahu Sedika Tentanga. Ayasaya Pernam Menyabut Bawa Jeb Perempian Yong Sungat Sisha. Tidak Pernam Menika Meskapan Banyak Yong Menurankin. Jed Tingal di Marine Parade Hamper. Sapanjang Hedupnia. Tedapi Judra Saja. Tidak Ada Yong Tahu Kisaling Kapnia. Jonathan Marasakin di Gupjan Tunya Bertamba Sipat. Aye Lala Menjularkin Salin Surat Eleanor Yong. Aye Tamukandari Arsa Digital. Melitak Kanya di Meja. Ruang Tiemi Ruma itu. George Membeka Dengen Sexama. Lalo Turdayam Lama. Matanya Burkakaka. Jadi. Diaman Sintai Caesar and the America. UCAP Georgia Kernia. Tidak Perna Ada Yong Mensaridikan How Aini Kepidakami. Tidak Heron de Memalai Hidup Sendiri. Munkin Atinya Suda Turtambat Pada Orang itu. Marika Dudu Kukup Lama. Berbikra Tentang Eleanor Dan Kaluarga Whitfield. George Menenjukin Sabua Kotuk Keu Tua Yong de Werskin Darianya. Di Dalamnya Turtapat Beberapa Photo Heighten Beauty. Sabajian Suda Malai Mamuder. Solus Atunya Menampilkin Sirang Perempuan Muda Berdiri di Tepi Lot. Menjanakan Gon Sederhana. Rambutnya Dijlung Rapi. George Yakin itu Adela Eleanor. Jonathan Minadat Photo. Itu Lama Sakali. I Marasakan Semicam Resonantiane. Silola Waja Perempuan di Photo. Itu Sedang Minatat Balik. Kepadanya Dari Masa Lalu. Hari Barakutnya. Jonathan Semikin Larat Dalam Penkarianya. Aye Menuli Sidiap Detail Yong Aye Temukin. Mengen Junji Kimbali Tempat Yong Munkin Daikin Jungi Eleanor. Swadasor. Aye Burgelin Menusuri Dermaga Brighton. Minkolba Membayank and Bagamana. Rosania Berdiri Disana Hampier Seretas Tan Lalu. Minatap Lot Dengen Hattie Penakarindu and Kepida. Caesarang Yong Tak Perna Kimbali. Naaman. Ada Bagyan Lane Dari Kisa. Aini Yong Masi Mengentung. Kihijapan Henry D. Boston Sebla Meningal Dunya. Jonathan Maresa. Aye Harus Kimbali Lagi Kumerica Untuckman Kari Lebi Dalam. Aye Injin Tau di Rumasakit Mana Henry Dirawat. Siapa Yong Mengi Rusnia Sat Hari Terakurnia. Dan Apaka Ada Katan Pabadi Lane Yong Diding Galkin. Seblam Kembali. Jonathan Memutuskan Untuck Menitup Pergelananya D. Brighton Dangan Sabua. Kunjungan Lagi. Kamakam Eleanor. Ayam Boss Tankai Bungamawar Puti Dan. Menarunya D. Adas Nissan Seder Hana itu. Kali Aini. Ayatadak Handyman Baker Sir Henry D. Tepi Lot. Tedapi Juga Memika Kanya Pelin D. Depimakam Eleanor. Katakata Henry Seekin Malayang D. Dara. Akurnya Menkapai Talinga Yong Sihar Rusni Amendangarnya Pulahan Tan Lalu. Sekarang. Surat itu Suda Sampai. By Siknya. Kedaka Kembali Ka London Untuck Menjajar Penabangan Ka Boston. Jonathan marries a Perjalanan. Aini Suda Malai Baruba. Awalnya. Ay Hanya Menamukin Sabua Surat. to a sekra kabetulin. Kini I turjback dalum kisa, sinda yong tak, sempat menemukan penyelesaian. I marasakan bawa I sendiri menjadi bagian dari kisah itu. Penanda yang ditun untuk merangkai, kembali patangan-patangan yang tercerai-berai. Sesampainya di Boston lagi, I melanjutkan pencarian di Massachusetts General Hospital. Salah satu rumah sakit tertua di kota itu. Dengan bantuan serene petugas arsip yang ramah bernama Samuel, I menemukan kejadian pasien tahun 1926. Dan di sana tertulis nama Henry Whitfield. Penyakitnya tercatat sebagai pneumonia parah, yang pada masa itu sering berakibat fatal. Namun, hal yang paling menjejaskan adalah sebuah kejadian kesal yang ditulis oleh perawat di kejadian medis. Patient spoke often of a woman named Eleanor, asked if letter had arrived. Jonathan menitap matanya sejenak. Jadi bahkan hingga akhir hidupnya, Henry tetap memikirkan Eleanor. Ia sempat menunggu. Bertanya-tanya apakah surat dari Inggris pernah sampai kepadanya. Hatinya semakin berat, membayangkan kesedihan ganda itu. Dua orang yang saling mencintai, terpisah oleh lautan, lalu oleh cremation, tanpa pernah bisa bertemu kembali. Tetapi ada satu hal lagi yang menarik perhatiannya. Dalam arsip rumah sakit juga tercatat bahwa barang-barang pribadi Henry, termasuk sebuah kotak kesel, disimpan di sebuah gudang arsip, kemudian dipindahkan ke Museum Sejarah Medis Kota. Jonathan segera menuju ke sana, penaharap, di museum. Seorang curator bernama Linda membantunya membuka koleksi pribadi yang jarang disentuh. Dan di sana, di dalam kotak kayu kesel dengan label pudar, I menemukan barang-barang milik Henry. Sebuah jam saku, sehilai sapi tangan border dengan huruf E, dan buku kejadian tipis. Buku kejadian itu berisi tulisan tangan Henry. Puisi-puisi singkat, kejadian harian yang sederhana, dan berulang kali menyebut nama Eleanor. Dalam salah satu halamannya tertulis kalimat, "If the sea takes me, let my words reach her, even if I cannot." Jonathan menyedap buku itu dengan tangan gemetar. Rasanya seperti sedang menyentuh Henry secara langsung, merasakan sini yang tetap hidup meski tubuhnya telah lama tiada. I menyadari bahwa kisah ini bukan hanya kisah Henry dan Eleanor, tetapi juga sermon untuk dirinya sendiri. Sejak kehilangan Margaret, I sering merasa hidupnya hampa. Namun melihat jejak senda body, dua orang asing ini, I merasakan secerca penghiburan. Bahwa senda yang sejati tidak pernah benar-benar hilang, hanya berganti bentuk menjadi kinangan, menjadi bisikan halus yang berdaan melewati waktu. Malam itu, Jonathan berjalan sendirian di tepi Charles River. Angin dingin menerpa wajahnya, memantulkan cahaya lampu kota. Ia membuka buku kejadian Henry, membaca puisi-puisi itu sambil menatap arus sungai. Ia merasa seperti sedang berdialog dengan masa lalu. Sila Henry berdiri di sampingnya, menatap ke arah yang sama, dan di dalam hatinya, Jonathan tahu perjalanan ini belum usai. Ia masih harus menghabiskan temuan-temuan ini dengan keluarga Whitfield yang masih hidup. George di Brighton harus tahu bahwa Henry benar-benar mencintai Eleanor hingga akhir hidupnya. Surat-surat itu, kejadian-kejadian itu, semuanya harus dikembalikan ke keluarga sebagai warisan seni yang hilang. Dengan pikiran itu, Jonathan menatap katatannya, menatap air berkelon, dan berjanji pada dirinya sendiri bahwa ia akan menyatukan cerita ini sampai tuntas. Under the pale glow of the lamplight inside Henry's small rented room above the cobbled streets of Beacon Hill, the letter lay unfolded upon his desk. The edges had already begun to fray from his constant handling, as though the paper itself resisted the intrusion of time. Each night, When the bustle of Boston fell quiet and the city seemed to retreat into slumber, Henry found himself staring at the looping handwriting, replaying the mystery again and again in his mind. The letter, dated March 12, 1894, bore the signature of a name he had never encountered before, Charlotte Wickham. It spoke not in generalities, but with striking precision, a farewell addressed to a man called Edward, a lover perhaps, or a confidant. There were references to travel across the Atlantic, mentions of London's fog-laden docks, and a confession of something left behind that could no longer be spoken aloud. Henry read the words so many times that he began to feel as though Charlotte's presence lingered in the room, her voice whispering with every turn of the fragile page. On a damp Thursday morning in late October, Henry decided to take his search further. He walked down Charles Street to a local library, its tall windows fogged by the chill in the air. Inside, the smell of polished wood and aged leather welcomed him. He spoke to the librarian, an older woman named Margaret, who listened attentively as he explained what he had found. Margaret adjusted her spectacles, glanced at the letter, and smiled faintly, telling him that old correspondences often turned up tucked into the bindings of antique books. But when Henry pointed to the signature, her eyes sharpened. She leaned closer and said she had once read about a Wickham family in England, connected to trade and shipping during the late 19th century. Henry felt a stirring of purpose. He spent hours in the reading room, flipping through genealogical records, maritime registers, and fragments of personal memoirs. His fingers grew dark with dust, his head heavy with the scent of old paper. At one point, as the clock chimed 3 in the afternoon, he came across a name, Edward Hensley, listed as a passenger on a vessel departing Boston for London in 1894. The date of departure coincided eerily with the time mentioned in Charlotte's letter. The more Henry uncovered, the more the city seemed to shift around him. Each brick building and iron railing whispered the lives that had passed before. In the evenings, when fog crept in from the harbor and shrouded the gas lamps in a halo of dim orange, he would wander the narrow streets, imagining Edward's footsteps echoing in the past. He wondered what had bound Edward and Charlotte together so tightly, and what had forced them apart. His nights became restless. He dreamed of Victorian London, of the clatter of horse-drawn carriages over wet stones, of Charlotte standing beneath a lamppost with a letter clutched to her chest. Sometimes he woke in a sweat, convinced that he had heard a knock on his door, as though she were calling to him from across time. One evening, at the edge of winter, Henry sat in a small cafe near the Boston Common, the letter folded carefully inside his coat pocket. Snowflakes drifted beyond the glass, catching the light like fleeting sparks. Across the room, he noticed a young English woman sketching in a notebook. Her name, he would later learn, was Eleanor Clark. She had been in Boston only briefly, staying with relatives while she prepared to return home to Oxford. There was something in her manner, in the quiet precision of her movements, that reminded Henry of the handwriting in the letter, driven by a mixture of curiosity and impulse. He introduced himself. Eleanor listened patiently as he recounted the story of the letter, her eyes widening at the mention of Charlotte Wickham. She told him that her family, too, had distant ties to the Wickhams, though she knew only fragments of their history. It was enough to ignite in Henry a sense that fate had placed her before him. They agreed to meet again the next day at the library. Together they pored over archives, tracing lines of descent, uncovering names long buried in lists and ledgers. Eleanor's presence added warmth to Henry's search. Her laughter lightened the hours. Her sharp mind drew connections he had overlooked. As the days stretched into weeks, Henry found himself anticipating not just the mystery's unraveling, but the quiet companionship that grew between them. Yet, the letter itself remained unresolved. Who exactly was Charlotte writing to? Why did she speak of leaving something behind? Something that could never be spoken of. The unanswered questions pulled them onward like a tide. By mid-December, Eleanor prepared to sail back to England. The thought of her departure struck Henry with an ache he could not easily explain. He handed her a carefully wrapped folder containing a copy of the letter and his notes. He asked her to continue the search once she returned to Oxford, to walk the streets where Charlotte had lived, and perhaps find what Boston's archives could not reveal. Eleanor promised she would. She pressed his hand in farewell, her eyes lingering with something unspoken, and when she boarded her ship, Henry stood on the icy docks, the winter wind whipping his coat, watching as her figure grew smaller against the gray horizon. The weeks that followed fell hollow. The streets of Boston, once alive with possibility, now seemed to echo with absence. But Henry continued his research, clinging to the hope that Eleanor's letters from England would arrive soon, carrying news of discoveries that might finally give voice to Charlotte's story. And so, the old letter remained on his desk, its presence constant, a bridge between 2 centuries, 2 continents, and perhaps 2 hearts yet to find their true course. When Eleanor arrived back in England in early January, the winter was particularly harsh. Oxford streets were quiet beneath a blanket of frost, the lamps burning dimly as evening fell early each day. The scent of coal smoke clung to the air, mingling with the sharp bite of cold. She returned to her family's townhouse on Banbury Road, carrying with her not only her belongings from America, but also the folder Henry had entrusted to her. The letter, now carefully preserved in parchment, was her constant companion, resting inside her desk drawer, but never far from her thoughts. Nights in Oxford brought a different kind of silence than Boston. Here the quiet was heavy, almost scholarly, as though centuries of thought and study had settled into the very stones. Eleanor would sit by the fire, the orange glow flickering across her face, and read Charlotte's words again. She could hear Henry's voice in her memory, recounting the moment he had first discovered the letter in that little Boston bookshop. It felt strange, yet deeply compelling, that a story so rooted in the past had bound the 2 of them together across an ocean. Determined to learn more, Eleanor began her search at the Bodleian Library. She spent long hours in the reading rooms, requesting archives that stretched back to the late Victorian era. The sound of shuffling feet on old floors, the occasional call from a fellow researcher, and the scratching of quills and pens were her constant soundtrack. She would spread documents across the heavy wooden tables, tracing names and addresses, connecting fragments that hinted at Charlotte Whitcomb's life. On one particular afternoon, as the gray January light seeped weakly through the tall windows, Eleanor found a mention of Charlotte Whitcomb in a shipping register dated 1894. It confirmed that she had indeed sailed from London to Boston at least once. The register noted her as a passenger on a vessel named the Ardent, which had docked in New York before continuing northward. Yet there was no mention of Edward Hensley on that same voyage. Eleanor frowned, puzzled, her gloved hand resting on the page. Later that week, she traveled by train to London. The journey took her through landscapes stripped bare by winter, skeletal trees rising against pale skies, villages wrapped in mist, the fields frozen and brittle. By the time she reached Paddington Station, night had fallen. The city greeted her with the clamor of horse-drawn carriages, the glow of gas lamps struggling against the fog, and the scent of damp stone mingled with the tang of the Thames. Eleanor rented a modest room at a boarding house in Bloomsbury, a district known for its intellectuals and its nearness to the British Museum. From there, she began visiting archives that might contain records of the Whitcomb family. Day after day, she walked the streets in her heavy coat, her breath cloudy in the air, her boots clicking across wet cobblestones. It was in one of these visits, at the Guildhall Library, that she stumbled upon a journal belonging to a shipping company clerk. The leather binding was cracked, the ink faded, yet the entries were precise. In March 1894, the clerk mentioned a delayed voyage due to the absence of a passenger named Edward Hensley. The name leapt from the page, sending a chill down Eleanor's spine. She copied the entry carefully, her mind racing. That evening, back in her room, she wrote a long letter to Henry. She described the fog that clung to London, the cold seeping into her bones, the thrill of uncovering Edward's name. She asked him how he was managing in Boston, if he still wandered the streets at night thinking of Charlotte. She confessed, almost reluctantly, that she found herself thinking not just of Charlotte and Edward, but also of him. Her handwriting wavered slightly as she wrote those words, as though her own feelings had startled her. Weeks turned into months. Eleanor pieced together fragments of Charlotte's life: an address in Kensington, a family burial plot in Highgate Cemetery, a mention in a society column about a woman who had mysteriously withdrawn from public life after returning from abroad. Each discovery added weight to the mystery, but also deepened the sense of melancholy that clung to Charlotte's story. Henry, meanwhile, replied with equal fervor. His letters arrived across the Atlantic, sometimes delayed by storms, but always filled with careful observations. He described Boston under snow, the quiet beauty of the Charles River when it froze, the creak of old taverns where sailors still told tales of long-forgotten voyages. He wrote of missing her presence beside him in the library, of longing for the sound of her laughter as they pieced together clues. His words carried warmth across the miles, and Eleanor read them by candlelight, her heart stirring with something she was not yet ready to name. In late March, Eleanor visited Highgate Cemetery. The day was damp, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press low upon the earth. She walked the winding paths between ivy-covered graves, her breath catching in the silence broken only by the cawing of crows. There, among weathered stones, she found the Wickham family plot. The names carved into the marble were faded, some nearly illegible, but one stood clear enough. Charlotte Wickham, 1869 to 1901. The sight rooted her to ground. Charlotte had lived beyond the date of the letter by only 7 years. Eleanor traced the name with her gloved fingers, feeling the cold stone beneath. Who had she been, truly? And what sorrow had shadowed her final years? The questions pressed heavily upon her. That evening, back in Bloomsbury, Eleanor wrote again to Henry. She told him of standing before Charlotte's grave, of the cold air in her lungs, of the strange stillness that surrounded her. She admitted she felt as though Charlotte's voice lingered still, urging her to look deeper, and she promised she would not stop until she understood the truth. The correspondence between Eleanor and Henry grew more personal as spring approached. Their letters shifted subtly from formal reports of research into confessions of sleepless nights, of longing, of a sense that the mystery was more than history. It was a thread binding their own lives. Henry, in one of his letters, wrote that he could not walk past a Boston bookshop without feeling as though Charlotte herself had guided him there, so that Eleanor might one day hold the letter. By May, Eleanor began to uncover whispers of scandal. A forgotten ledger from a Kensington household hinted at debts and hurried departures. An old neighbor's diary, tucked away in the archives, mentioned Charlotte's sudden return from Boston and a child who was never publicly acknowledged. The entries were vague, filled with implication rather than clarity, but they hinted at a secret large enough to fracture a family standing. As Eleanor copied these fragments by lamplight, she thought of Henry's steady hands, his eyes lighting up at each discovery. She longed for him to be beside her, to walk the foggy London streets together, to share the silence of Highgate's paths. Her letters to him grew longer, filled with details of her days, of the sound of bells from St. Paul's, of the scent of lilacs blooming despite the soot that darkened the city. She did not realize until she signed her name one night how much affection had slipped into her words. The mystery was far from solved, but had begun to take shape. A woman caught between two worlds, two cities, and perhaps two loves. Charlotte's story, though distant in years, seemed to mirror their own in ways Eleanor could not ignore. And as spring turned towards summer, Eleanor received word from Henry that he planned to cross the ocean, to come to England himself, so that together they might finally unravel the truth that had lain hidden for more than a century. The letter that had once rested quietly in a forgotten bookshop in Boston had now carried two lives into an unfolding story. Eleanor sat at her writing desk in her Bloomsbury lodging during one warm June evening. Her windows opened to the hum of London's restless streets. The air was heavy with the scent of horse sweat and coal smoke, mingled faintly with the perfume of flowers sold by women on the corners. She had just finished reading Henry's latest letter, in which he confessed, without the elaborate restraint of his earlier notes, that he had secured passage across the Atlantic. He would be arriving at Liverpool within 3 weeks, and from there, traveling directly to London. Eleanor let the paper slip from her fingers. Her heart, which had long maintained the steady rhythm of a scholar immersed in her research, beat with a nervous quickness. She imagined seeing Henry again, not in the soft glow of Boston Cafe, nor in the hushed rooms of a library, but here, in the city that had shaped Charlotte's secrets. The thought brought both comfort and unease, as though the past and present were colliding in ways she could not predict. During the days that followed, she prepared. She revisited the Highgate Cemetery, placing fresh flowers at Charlotte's grave, whispering questions into the silence. She spent long afternoons combing through archives, carefully collecting names, addresses, and references that might prove useful when Henry arrived. Yet at night, she found herself restless, pacing her room, her candle guttering in the drafts that slipped through the old windows. On the morning of Henry's arrival, Eleanor traveled by train to Liverpool. The station was alive with noise and smoke, the hiss of steam engines mixing with the shouts of porters and the murmur of travelers. The air was thick with the scent of salt carried inland from the docks. She stood near the platform, clutching her gloves tightly, her eyes scanning the crowd of passengers disembarking from the transatlantic steamer. And then she saw him, Henry, taller than she remembered, his coat marked by the long journey, his face weary but brightening the moment his eyes found hers. For a moment, the noise of the station seemed to recede, as though the world itself paused to allow their reunion. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying both relief and something deeper. She smiled, though her cheeks flushed, and held out her hand. "Henry, you made it." Their hands met briefly, politely, yet both felt the warmth linger longer than courtesy demanded. The train journey back to London passed in a blur of conversation. They spoke of his voyage across the Atlantic, of storms that had rocked the ship, of the strange camaraderie among passengers bound for new beginnings. Eleanor shared her discoveries, the shipping registers, the scandal hinted at in Kensington, the grave in Highgate. Henry listened with an intensity that reminded her of those long hours in the Boston library, his dark eyes fixed on her as though every word carried weight. By the time they reached the city, dusk was falling. London glowed with gaslight, the fog beginning to thicken in the streets. Together they walked from the station to Bloomsbury, their footsteps echoing on the slick pavement. Neither spoke much then, content with the quiet presence of the other. Over the next weeks, they became inseparable. Each morning they set out with maps and notes, tracing Charlotte's life through the labyrinth of the city. They visited the narrow lane in Kensington where Charlotte had once resided, the windows now shuttered, the paint peeling. They spoke with an elderly woman who remembered hearing whispers, as a child, about the Wickham family, about a daughter who returned from America under mysterious circumstances, rarely seen in society afterward. One evening in late June, as the air hung heavy with the promise of summer rain, Henry and Eleanor walked along the Thames. The river rolled darkly beneath the bridges, its surface glinting with the reflections of lamps. A warm wind carried the smell of tar and salt from the ship's dock nearby. "It feels as though she's still here," Henry murmured, leaning on the railing. as if Charlotte walks with us, waiting for us to understand her silence. Eleanor, standing beside him, tightened her shawl around her shoulders. I'd begun to wonder if it was not only love she left behind, but something heavier, something she couldn't carry with her across the ocean. Henry turned to her then, his expression caught between admiration and unease. "You've done so much, Eleanor. I would never have come this far without you." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her. She lowered her gaze, feeling her cheeks warm. "And I would never have believed Charlotte's story mattered so deeply, if not for you." For a long moment, the city hummed around them while they stood in silence, bound not only by Charlotte's letter, but by an unspoken bond growing stronger each day. Their investigation soon led them to a set of court records from the late 1890s. Within them, they discovered mention of a dispute involving the Whitcomb family estate. The case referred vaguely to an inheritance withheld, to questions of legitimacy concerning a child. Eleanor's heart raced as she read the lines aloud to Henry in the dim reading room, the lamplight flickering on the page. The words seemed to confirm what had been hinted at in private diaries, that Charlotte had borne a child who had never been formally acknowledged. The revelation changed everything. If Charlotte's farewell letter had been to Edward Hensley, perhaps the something left behind she spoke of was not only her reputation or her love, but her child. One sweltering afternoon in July, Eleanor and Henry traveled again to Highgate, this time searching for smaller plots adjacent to the Whitcomb family grave. There, half hidden beneath ivy, they found a stone carved with name nearly erased by time. Eleanor knelt before it, brushing away dirt with her glove, her voice trembling as she read the faint letters. Samuel, 1894 to 1897. Henry crouched beside her, the weight of the discovery pressing down upon them both. "Her son," he whispered. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. The child's short life explained the whispers, the scandal, the silence that had cloaked Charlotte's later years. And yet it raised further questions. Who had fathered the boy? Was Edward truly connected? Or was the truth even more complicated than they had imagined? As rain began to fall softly on the graves, Eleanor felt Henry's hand brush against hers, not in deliberate gesture, but in shared grief. For a moment, the silence between them was filled with both sorrow for the past and an undeniable awareness of the present. The weeks that followed brought more searching, more unanswered questions, but also more moments of closeness. They dined together in small taverns near Chancery Lane, their conversations drifting from research to laughter, from speculation to personal confession. Henry spoke of his quiet childhood in Boston, Eleanor of her years in Oxford surrounded by books, but longing for something more alive. And always Charlotte lingered. Her voice seemed to echo in the pages they turned, in the streets they walked, in the shadows of the city that had both hidden and revealed her. By the time August arrived, London baked under rare heat, the parks filled with families seeking shade, the air heavy with the smell of dust and roses. Henry and Eleanor sat together on a bench in Hyde Park one afternoon, the sound of carriages clattering in the distance. Henry unfolded the original letter once more, the ink faded but still legible, and placed it gently in Eleanor's hands. "She began this story," he said softly, "but I think it was meant to be finished by us." Eleanor met his gaze, her breath catching at the weight of his words. She felt the truth of them, not only about Charlotte, but about the path that had drawn the two of them together across continents. And though Charlotte's secret still lingered unresolved, though questions remained like shadows in the corners of their search, both Henry and Eleanor knew that the story had already altered the course of their own lives in ways neither had anticipated. By the time September arrived, the sweltering haze of London summer had given way to the first cool winds of autumn. The city shifted in character. The streets, once sticky with dust and the restless cries of vendors, now carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves. Gas lamps flickered earlier in the evenings, and fog began to creep back from the river, softening the outlines of bridges and spires. For Henry and Eleanor, the change of seasons seemed to mirror their own state of mind. The discoveries of summer had been filled with light and heat, intense revelations about Charlotte's son, Samuel, and the shadow of scandal surrounding the Whitcomb family. But autumn brought with it a quieter persistence, a sense that the mystery required not only passion but patience. They often met in the mornings at the reading room of the British Museum, the high dome overhead, echoing with a faint shuffle of footsteps, lent their research a kind of solemn grandeur. Eleanor would bring her neat stacks of notes, Henry his careful transcriptions. Together, they pieced through ship manifests, court records, and fading society columns. Each fragment was like a loose thread, yet they both believed that if they tugged long enough, the tapestry of Charlotte's story would eventually reveal itself. One morning, Eleanor discovered a curious entry in a shipping ledger from 1895. It listed Edward Hensley as a passenger departing Liverpool for Calcutta. The notation was brief, but it stunned them both. If Edward had left England only a year after Charlotte's letter, then perhaps he had indeed been fleeing more than just a failed love affair. Calcutta, Henry repeated softly, his finger tracing the faded ink. Why would he have gone so far? Eleanor looked up from her notebook, her expression thoughtful. In that era, many men went east for trade, or to escape debts, or to disappear entirely. Henry leaned back, rubbing his temple. And if he never returned, then Charlotte was left alone with a child who may have been his. That would explain everything. The silence, the scandal, the loneliness carved into her last years. Their conversation carried a weight that neither could shake. The idea of Edward vanishing to the far reaches of the empire painted him as both coward and victim of circumstance. Eleanor wondered aloud whether Charlotte had ever received word from him after he left. Henry doubted it. Silence, it seemed, was Edward's legacy. As autumn deepened, Henry and Eleanor's days took on a rhythm. Research by daylight, long walks through the mist-laden streets by evening. Sometimes they spoke endlessly, weaving together theories about Charlotte and Edward. Other times, they walked in silence, listening only to the muffled clip of horses' hooves and the occasional distant cry of a street vendor. One evening in October, they found themselves crossing Westminster Bridge. The Thames rolled dark beneath them, its surface disturbed by passing barges. The Houses of Parliament loomed through the fog, their lights glowing faintly. Henry paused, resting his hand on the cold stone railing, and turned toward Eleanor. "Do you ever feel," he asked, his voice quieter than the river itself, "that Charlotte is guiding us, as though she wants us to follow, to uncover the truth she could never speak?" Eleanor, her shawl pulled tightly against the chill, studied his face. "Yes, often. It feels less like research now and more like answering a call." Henry's gaze lingered on her longer than usual. In that moment, Eleanor felt the weight of unspoken words pressing between them, as heavy as the fog. But before either could break the silence, the bells of Big Ben struck the hour, startling them back to the present. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, though neither dared to define it. Letters had carried the first sparks, but the rhythm of shared purpose and quiet companionship fanned them into something more. When Henry grew weary, Eleanor encouraged him. When she doubted their progress, his optimism sustained her. They became, in every sense, partners, not only in unraveling Charlotte's mystery, but in navigating the shadows of their own hearts. In late October, Eleanor arranged a meeting with a man named Thomas Whitcomb, a distant relative of Charlotte's. He was elderly now, his health failing, but he agreed to see them in his Hampstead home. The journey there took them through leafy streets, where autumn leaves rustled beneath their boots and smoke curled from chimneys into the gray sky. Thomas received them in a parlor heavy with the scent of tobacco and old books. His voice was thin, but his eyes still sharp. When Eleanor gently asked about Charlotte, he grew quiet. She was, he said slowly, a woman who carried too much sorrow. There were whispers in the family. Of course, whispers of a child, of a man who vanished. But Charlotte herself spoke little. She withdrew, as if the world had wounded her too deeply. Henry leaned forward. Do you know who the man was? Thomas hesitated, his gaze turning to the fire. A name was spoken once, though never in open conversation. Hensley, but I cannot tell you more. Only that Charlotte deserved better than the silence she was given. The interview ended soon after, but his words lingered with them long into the night. As they walked back through Hampstead Heath, the leaves crackling underfoot, Eleanor felt the sorrow of Charlotte's story pressing more heavily upon her. In November, as fog settled thick over the city, Eleanor and Henry uncovered one final clue in a faded archive at Lincoln's Inn. It was a letter and signed, but written in a hand that Eleanor recognized from documents connected to Edward Hensley. The letter, dated from Calcutta in 1896, spoke of regret, of a promise broken, of a woman and child left behind. It ended abruptly, as though the writer could not bring himself to finish. Reading it aloud, Eleanor's voice faltered. Henry reached across the table, steadying the paper with his hand. The silence between them was filled with both triumph and grief. They had found Edward's voice at last, but it was too late for Charlotte, too late for Samuel. The past had remained what it was, tragic, unresolved, irretrievable. The evening after Jonathan discovered the letter, he could not sleep. The hotel bed in Beacon Hill was comfortable enough. Yet his mind refused to let go of the faded handwriting and the gentle sorrow embedded in Henry Whitfield's words. Around midnight, the glow of the street lamps outside painted long golden streaks across his room. He sat by the window, listening to the muted hum of passing cars, and made a decision. He would dedicate the remainder of his trip not to museums or restaurants, but to uncovering the story behind the letter. The following morning, he returned to Whitmore's rare and used books. The shop smelled of dust and cedar oil, and the owner lifted his eyes from the ledger with mild curiosity when Jonathan placed a poetry volume on the counter. Jonathan asked carefully whether Mr. Whitmore knew anything about the book's previous owner. The old man frowned thoughtfully, rummaged through a box of index cards behind the counter, and eventually found a record. He explained that the book had been part of a collection donated by a family estate in Cambridge decades earlier. Unfortunately, no details about the family had been kept. Just a brief note that the items had belonged to a Whitfield household. The name leapt out. Whitfield, perhaps a descendant of Henry himself. Jonathan pressed gently for more information, but Mr. Whitmore had little else to offer. He encouraged Jonathan to visit the Boston Public Library, where local archives might yield clues. Jonathan thanked him, tucked the poetry book under his arm, and stepped out into the morning air with a renewed sense of purpose. Boston Public Library, with its grand Renaissance Revival facade, stood proud on Boylston Street. Jonathan felt almost reverent as he entered, his footsteps echoing across the marble floor of the Bates Hall. After a short conversation with a reference librarian named Margaret, he was guided to a microfilm collection of city directories from the 1920s. Hours passed as Jonathan scrolled through faded records of names and addresses. Then, finally, there it was: Henry Whitfield, occupation listed as clerk, shipping office, residence on Tremont Street, 1923. Jonathan's heart raced as if he had uncovered buried treasure. He copied the details into his notebook, then leaned back with a sigh of satisfaction. But this was only the beginning. What became of Henry? Did he remain in Boston, or did he return to England? And Eleanor, who was she? Margaret, noticing Jonathan's excitement, asked if he wished to continue tracing Whitfield's trail through immigration and census records. Grateful, he accepted, Together they unearthed fragments. Henry's arrival in Boston from Liverpool in 1921 aboard the SS Carmania, his listing as unmarried, age 27, with an occupation in trade. There was no record of a marriage in Boston, nor of his naturalization as an American citizen. Strangely, after 1925, Henry's name seemed to vanish from the directories. Jonathan left the library that evening with more questions than answers. The letter in his pocket felt heavier, as though urging him not to stop now. That night, he penned notes in his journal, mapping out timelines and possibilities. He resolved to visit the Massachusetts Historical Society the following day. The Society's reading room was quiet, filled with the scent of polished wood and the faint rustle of scholars turning delicate pages. There, Jonathan searched shipping records, hoping to discover Henry had returned to England. Hours slipped by. At last, buried in a register of outbound passengers from Boston Harbor in 1925, he found an entry. Henry Whitfield, departing aboard the SS Cedric, bound for Southampton. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the still room. Henry had indeed gone back. Armed with this knowledge, Jonathan realized his journey might extend beyond Boston. If he truly wished to follow the trail, he would need to return to England sooner than planned. But before leaving, he wanted to walk the same streets Henry once had, to sense the echoes of his presence. The next morning, under a sky the color of pewter, Jonathan strolled along Tremont Street, picturing Henry in his 20s, carrying ledgers and documents, weaving to the crowds of businessmen and dock workers. He wandered down toward the harbor, where gulls circled and the scent of salt water filled the air. Jonathan imagined Henry standing there, gazing at the ships, longing for Eleanor. Later that afternoon, Jonathan visited the archives of the Boston Globe. With the help of another librarian, he combed through old issues around 1923. To his astonishment, he found a small personal notice published in June of that year. H.W. sends his thoughts across the sea to Ian, Sussex. May our distance not diminish hope. Jonathan whispered the words aloud, feeling a shiver run through him. It was Henry, reaching across an ocean through the columns of a newspaper. That evening, Jonathan sat in a quiet cafe in Back Bay, sipping black coffee while rain tapped gently against the window. He studied the letter again, noting the tenderness in Henry's phrasing, the precise way he described Eleanor's laughter and the sound of her footsteps on the garden path back in England. He felt a growing connection not only to Henry and Eleanor, but to the very idea of love persisting across time and distance. 2 days later, Jonathan boarded a flight back to London, the letter carefully tucked in his notebook. The plane cut through clouds, and as the Atlantic stretched endlessly below, Jonathan reflected on how the sea that once separated Henry and Eleanor was now beneath him as well. He felt as though he were retracing Henry's journey, but in reverse. Upon arriving in England, Jonathan wasted no time. He traveled to Sussex, armed with the name Eleanor and the clue from the newspaper notice. In the archives of the local historical society, he combed through marriage records, birth registries, and parish documents. Eventually, he uncovered a promising lead. An Eleanor Marlowe, born in 1897, residing in Lewes during the early 1920s. Her name appeared in the parish records of St. Michael's Church. Jonathan visited the church the following morning. It was a modest stone building, surrounded by gravestones weathered by wind and rain. Inside, the quiet was broken only by the faint echo of his footsteps. A church warden, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, listened patiently as Jonathan explained his research. To his surprise, she remembered hearing of the Marlowe family from her grandparents' stories. Eleanor, she said, had been known for her kindness and her singing voice in the choir. Mrs. Green directed Jonathan to the local cemetery, where Eleanor's name might be found. Jonathan walked through rows of moss-covered headstones until his eyes caught the inscription, Eleanor Marlowe, 1897 to 1979. He stood silently, the autumn wind rustling the leaves around him. She had lived a long life, far beyond the fragile letter he now carried. But had she and Henry ever been reunited? He could not stop here. The puzzle demanded more. Somewhere, perhaps in parish records or family papers, lay the answer. Did Henry return to her in 1925? Did their love endure? Or did the letter remain a promise never fulfilled? Jonathan closed his notebook, the questions echoing in his mind like distant bells. The journey was far from over, and each discovery only deepened the mystery. The story of Henry and Eleanor was unfolding piece by piece, waiting for him to uncover its truth. Jonathan left the cemetery with a strange mix of emotions. The sight of Eleanor's gravestone had been both a comfort and a burden. Comfort, because it proved that she had lived a full life in the land she called home. Burden, because there was no clear indication whether Henry had ever returned to her, no obvious sign of reunion. The unanswered questions lingered like a fog in his thoughts. He took the narrow road leading back into Lewis, the evening light softening across the rooftops, and promised himself he would not abandon the trail here. That night, in a small and on the edge of town, he sat by the window with a notebook open, the letter beside him. He carefully wrote down every date, every name, every place he had uncovered. Henry's voyage in 1921, the letter from 1923, his departure back to England in 1925, Eleanor's presence in Sussex. It was as though he were drawing threads of two lives across the pages, trying to weave them into something whole. Yet there were still gaps, years unaccounted for, emotions unspoken beyond that one letter. The following morning, Jonathan sought out the local records office. A clerk with round spectacles and a patient manner guided him to parish registers and electoral rolls. Hours passed as Jonathan combed through them. At last, he found an entry from 1926. Henry Whitfield, residing in Lewis, listed at a small cottage on Malling Street. Jonathan's chest tightened as he traced the faded ink with his fingertip. Henry had returned. Eleanor's name appeared too, though still as Marlowe. In 1926, she had not yet married, at least not in the official records. Jonathan leaned back, the implications swirling. Had Henry come back and rejoined her life? Was there a marriage later? Or did circumstances still keep them apart? Determined to know more, Jonathan visited Malling Street. The cottages were old but well kept, brick walls covered in ivy, chimneys still sending thin trails of smoke into crisp autumn air. He stood before the house listed in the register, feeling the weight of history in the quiet street. He imagined Henry stepping through that very door, weary from travel, carrying the memories of Boston, hoping for Eleanor's embrace. He knocked softly, though he knew the chances were slim that the current occupants had any knowledge of its past. To his surprise, an elderly man opened the door. His name was Mr. Pritchard, and when Jonathan explained his search, the man chuckled and said he had only lived there a few decades. Yet he recalled stories passed down about a quiet Englishman who had come back from America in the 1920s. The details were vague, but enough to convince Jonathan he was on the right path. Back at the inn, Jonathan could barely sleep. He felt as though Henry and Eleanor's presence were pressing closer, urging him onward. The next day, he returned to the church records at St. Michael's. He asked again about marriages from the late 1920s. After some searching, the archivist smiled and handed him an entry. 1927. Henry Whitfield married Eleanor Marlowe. Jonathan's throat tightened as he whispered the names aloud. At last, the letter story had found its continuation, yet curiosity did not rest. What kind of life had they lived together? Were there children, descendants who might still carry fragments of their story? Jonathan spent the next week following their trail through census records and local newspapers. He learned that Henry had worked as a clerk for a local shipping office in New Haven. Eleanor had continued singing in the church choir. Together, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Jonathan traced the names of the children forward, discovering marriages, careers, and addresses scattered across Sussex and beyond. Eventually, his search led him to a woman named Margaret Turner, a granddaughter of Henry and Eleanor, living just outside Brighton. He hesitated before contacting her. What would she think of a stranger arriving with an old letter, stirring up the past? Yet he felt compelled to try. He wrote a careful letter, explaining who he was, what he had found in Boston, and how he had traced the story back to her family. He enclosed a photocopy of the letter Henry had written in 1923. A week later, Jonathan received a reply. Margaret was intrigued, even moved. She invited him to visit. The meeting took place on a cool afternoon in late October. Margaret's house stood in a quiet neighborhood, roses climbing up the front wall. She welcomed Jonathan warmly, her eyes filled with curiosity. Over tea, she explained that her family had indeed spoken often of Henry and Eleanor's unusual story, though not in detail. She had heard that Henry had gone to America, but returned for Eleanor. The original letters between them, however, had been thought lost. When Jonathan carefully unfolded the fragile sheet he found in Boston, Margaret's hands trembled slightly. She traced the handwriting with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. She explained that her grandmother Eleanor had kept many mementos of Henry, but after Eleanor's death, some had been scattered among relatives and others lost entirely. This letter, preserved in a book across the ocean, felt like a message returned home after nearly a century. Margaret then brought out a small wooden box, one that had belonged to Eleanor. Inside were photographs. Henry in a suit, standing proudly beside Eleanor in a garden, their children clustered around them. Jonathan studied the images, feeling an almost overwhelming sense of connection. Here was proof that their love had endured, that the letter he had stumbled upon was not a fragment of tragedy, but the beginning of a fulfilled promise. The afternoon faded into evening as Margaret shared stories. Eleanor had lived to see her grandchildren grow, always speaking fondly of Henry's determination and his deep loyalty. Henry himself had passed away in 1965, but his presence remained strong in family memory. The grandchildren had grown up hearing tales of how love had crossed the Atlantic, survived years of uncertainty, and finally blossomed into a life together. Jonathan left Margaret's home with gratitude and a deep sense of completion, yet his heart still carried a strange weight. The story of Henry and Eleanor had become entwined with his own life. He had been the one to stumble upon their hidden past, to reconnect the scattered fragments, to deliver the words of a man long gone back into the hands of his descendants. Back in his hotel that night, Jonathan opened his journal. He wrote of Henry and Eleanor, of the bookstore in Boston, of the dusty archives and the gravestones in Lewes, of Margaret's tears as she held the letter. He realized he had not just uncovered forgotten history. He had borne witness to the endurance of love across oceans and decades. And yet, as he closed his notebook, a question lingered. How many other letters lay hidden, waiting to be found? How many other stories remained folded in the pages of forgotten books, carrying voices across time to anyone willing to listen? Jonathan leaned back, the night silent around him, and felt that his journey was not finished. It had only just begun. Jonathan remained in Sussex for another 2 days after meeting Margaret Turner, reluctant to let go of the thread that had so unexpectedly tied him to another family's past. Each morning, he would walk to the narrow streets of Lewes, pausing at the churchyard where Eleanor lay, and each evening he would return to a small inn, sitting by the fire and rereading his notes as if the story could be stretched even further. But he knew, deep down, that the main arc had closed. Henry had returned. Eleanor had waited. They had married, built a family, lived long enough to see their grandchildren. The letter he had discovered in Boston had not been the beginning of tragedy. It had been the seed of a story fulfilled. On the third morning, Jonathan took a train back to London. The countryside rushed past his window, green fields and small villages softened by autumn's golden touch. He thought of Henry taking the same journey nearly a century earlier, perhaps with a suitcase at his side, perhaps with nervous hands as he prepared to face Eleanor again after years of separation. He imagined Eleanor waiting, her heart uncertain but hopeful, and how their reunion must have changed the course of both their lives. In London, Jonathan felt a curious emptiness. The city was loud and hurried, a stark contrast to the gentle pace of Sussex. He returned to his small flat in Hampstead, where shelves of his own books lined the walls, and placed Henry's letter carefully inside an archival envelope. He wanted it safe, preserved, but he also wanted it shared. He spent the following weeks writing. What had begun as notes in his journal grew into pages of narrative. He described the bookstore in Boston, the dust rising from its shelves the moment the letter had fluttered to the floor. He described the archives, the librarians, the long hours spent scrolling through microfilm or squinting at parish registers. He wrote about the cemetery in Lewes, the ivy-covered cottages on Malling Street, and finally the quiet dignity of Margaret Turner holding her grandmother's letter for the first time. The act of writing became more than documentation. It became a meditation. Jonathan realized he was not only recording Henry and Eleanor's story, but also his own. His chance discovery had changed him. Before Boston, his days as a retired teacher had been pleasant but unremarkable. He had filled them with books, quiet walks, occasional travels. Now, he felt invigorated by purpose. There was meaning in searching, in listening to the echoes of lives that had come before. When the manuscript was finished, nearly 200 pages in length, Jonathan sent a copy to Margaret. Weeks later, she replied with gratitude, saying that her family had read it aloud together, moved by the care and depth with which he had told the tale. Jonathan felt humbled. He had not expected to become a storyteller for strangers. Yet in a way, Henry and Eleanor were no longer strangers. They were part of him, woven into his own story. The months passed, and winter settled over London. One evening in December, Jonathan returned from a walk along the Thames and found a package waiting at his door. Inside was a small framed photograph. Eleanor in her later years, smiling, her hair silver, her eyes bright. Margaret had written a note. "So you may keep a piece of her with you, as she has kept a piece of you." Jonathan placed the photograph on his writing desk, beside the letter, and felt an odd warmth fill the room. In January, he returned once more to Boston, driven not by duty, but by a quiet longing. He visited Whitmore's bookstore again, greeted by the same creaking sign and the same scent of old paper. Mr. Whitmore recognized him, smiled, and asked whether the letter had led him anywhere. Jonathan shared only that it had brought peace to a family in England. He did not reveal the full story. It felt too sacred, too personal to scatter carelessly in casual words. Still, as he wandered the aisles of the bookstore, he found himself scanning the shelves differently now. He wondered how many other letters lay hidden, folded between pages, forgotten but not gone. He wondered how many voices from the past waited for someone, anyone, to find them and carry their words forward. In a quiet corner of the shop, Jonathan chose another volume, this time a collection of essays from the 19th century. He opened it slowly, half expecting another slip of paper to fall. Nothing did, yet he smiled. Perhaps not today, but someday another story might reveal itself. On his last night in Boston, he sat in his hotel room, gazing at the city lights shimmering beyond the window. He thought of Henry and Eleanor again, of how fragile their story had been, balanced on the chance survival of one letter. He thought how easily it might have remained hidden forever, how easily it might have been lost to dust and silence. And then he thought how it had found him, across decades and oceans, and how he had become its messenger. Jonathan whispered softly to the night, as if speaking to Henry himself. I carried your words back home. They reached your family. They are safe now. There was no answer, of course, except the low hum of the city outside. But Jonathan felt a deep stillness within, the kind that comes only when something has been set right. The letter lay on the desk, carefully folded, the ink faint but legible. A man's voice across time, preserved in fragile paper, carried by coincidence and curiosity, now anchored in memory. Jonathan knew that when his own time came, the letter would pass on, perhaps to a library, perhaps to another family member. Its journey would not end with him. And as he turned out the light, slipping into the calm of sleep, Jonathan carried one last thought with him, that the past is never truly silent. It waits, patient and unyielding, for someone to listen. And sometimes, if fortune allows, it speaks again.